Good morning and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. A few years ago, our confirmation class here at Redeemer was discussing Holy Communion. As we do every year when this topic comes up, at one point we asked them to go off into a small group and decide the one most important thing there is about communion, and then to develop a TV commercial about it and come back and present it to the rest of the children in other groups. We've had all sorts of things. Sometimes things that are completely new, sometimes things that borrow from popular commercials on TV at the time. But every time the groups come back with commercials that have depth and meaning and which show deep understanding of what communion is really about. A few years ago, one group came back and they gathered their group on one side of the room with one person alone on the other side of the room. The single person cried out, "Children, it's time for supper." And with that, all the kids in the group rushed across the room and fell on their knees before her with their hands out as if to receive communion. And that's when that single person said, "God, it's what's for dinner." Wow. All in one skit, they reflected on our intense hunger and need for this meal of salvation and on the real presence of Christ in the sacrament too. The commercial said that having communion is a basic necessity of life, as necessary as food itself. Food. This past Sunday was Worldwide Communion Sunday, when Christians all over the world celebrated Holy Communion. A few years ago, I developed a plan to talk to children preparing for their first communion and to talk about what was happening in communion, and I came up with 4 words that all start with the letter F. This week, I hope to talk you through those and maybe add a few other F words on Friday. Today's word is food, and it's an important part of what communion is about. It's happened twice. Twice in the Bible, when God saved God's people in special ways, God gave us a meal to remember it by. The first time happened when the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, and God sent Moses to lead them to freedom. After plagues of boils and frogs and gnats and hail and more, the Pharaoh still wouldn't let the people go. And so God told them to prepare a special meal. They sacrificed a lamb and put some blood on the doorposts of their homes. There were special herbs and foods they were to eat that night. And then, in the darkness, the angel of death passed through the land, and he skipped or passed over the homes that were marked by the blood. But the Egyptian homes, including the Pharaoh's, homes that weren't marked, in those homes the oldest child died. Filled with grief and anger, the Pharaoh sent the Hebrews away, and they left so fast that when they made bread for their journey, they didn't have time to let it rise. So it was unleavened, baked flat and hard. And of course, you know what happened next. By the time they had reached the sea, Pharaoh was after them to get them back, and God parted the sea for them to cross through, and then it crashed back down on the Egyptians who were following them. For generations of Jews, this event has marked a seminal moment, a time when God entered history and acted to save God's people. And every year they remembered it with a meal of salvation. They eat lamb and herbs and special foods, and they eat unleavened bread. And they call it Passover, and remember the salvation God worked among them. That's the very meal of salvation that Jesus was eating with his disciples when he took some of that flat bread and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." It was this meal of salvation they shared as he took a cup and said, "This is my blood." Jesus gave us a new meal of remembrance. Jesus gave us new food of salvation. The next day, the Lamb of God would be sacrificed, and this meal would help us remember. This meal would make it real for us. Sometimes when I'm talking to young children about communion, I'll say to them, "After you were born, did your parents ever feed you?" "Of course," they answer. And I say, "What would have happened if they never fed you?" And they answer, "We would have starved to death. We wouldn't be able to run or play or study or do anything." And that's when I say, when you were baptized, you were born into God's family. Communion is the food that feeds our souls and keeps us alive and going in our faith. It may not seem like much, just a little piece of bread and a splash of wine, but it's God's meal, a meal of salvation, a meal that feeds our faith. Come, children, it's time for dinner. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.